Joining us on this episode, Gabrielle Cuccia is with us. She is the Pentagon correspondent for One American News. She's out of D.C., paying attention to all things DOD. Gabrielle, congratulations on the gig, by the way. I've been seeing the clips from One American News. Let's start with this. So we got Pete Hegseth, who's an old buddy of mine from Media World. Sean Parnell, old buddy of mine from Media World. These are the people. Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense. Parnell is Undersecretary for Public Affairs or Communications. What are some of the top things? What are some of the initiatives underway right now in the Pentagon and for the military? Because it's not getting as much attention this week as some of the other big Trump initiatives.
Yeah, of course. Well, Buck, thanks for having me again. It feels really good to be at the Pentagon, especially just before I even get into the specifics. You know, you have, which I know this isn't news for you, but you have public affairs officers from every single branch of the military, and then by the comm center, of which they're strategically located to evaluate and to connect with the press on all arenas, whether it's PACOM, INDOCOM, or, down in South America, wherever it may be. So when we talk about the White House as it stands right now, of course, the media is just so worked up when there's directives or executive orders coming out at the Oval Office. But a lot of what Trump has done in that first term, and certainly to be seen in the second term, when you talk about Ukraine or the Gaza Strip or whatever it may be, or the southern border, right now that's under a DOD directive more so than it ever has been in our history, a lot of that stuff, it comes and boils up at the surface level of the Oval Office, but it's all happening at the Pentagon. So this is an insanely transparent administration. You have those public affairs officers there at the ready to answer any and all questions. I'll even tell you, just on being, purely honest, being in that arena and seeing all the press, whether it's mainstream, left, right, independent media, they're all talking in person. There's no closed door to any of these public affairs officers. So when you see the changes at the DOD that are incredibly positive, which I'll get into, it's wild that, the military tries, their best, right, to stay out of politics and focus solely on operations. And then you see some of these news networks, of which we know one of the ones that we kind of absolved their suite that the Pentagon had given them, and they're kind of just taking that information and then course correcting it in their eyes what they deem to be undeployable measures or bad takes by the Department of Defense, which is wild. I'd say the positive thing right now that some people are just missing, all in all, is outside of going through just the operations, is just how the military operates. We saw that President Trump put out an executive order in which transgender militants cannot be deployable. And we already knew this, which is really interesting, that historically back in 2021, transgender soldiers were quote unquote allowed or permissible in the Department of Defense, but they were never deployable for a few reasons, right? Like they couldn't have access in specific arenas to their medications, especially with COVCOM. You cannot have those weekly mandated or monthly mandated conversations with your mental health professional when you're going through quote unquote transition. So they were never being utilized in ways that warfighters are typically used. So this is more of just course correcting. Hey, we have all these bodies that aren't even able bodied in the sense of warfighting. So that's a huge positive that came out of this administration. But there's been a lot of media and conversations that I've had with other outlets in which they are so hyper focused on asking the DOD to prove and show elements or studies of which it shows that transgenders aren't able to serve in the military in a certain capacity. But I would just say purely on an operational level and access to medicine and whatever it may be, you can only put so much in your pack depending on what deployable arena you're entering. So that was a first great dodge at, rescinding what the Biden administration had already done in inflating the DOD.
Israeli citizens look for the return of normalcy in their country. It's hard to do when there's ceasefire negotiations happening, when there's increased tensions between Hamas and the IDF forces. Nearly 18 months after the Hamas invasion and brutal attack, life is not normal for everyone in Israel. As Israelis work hard to return to a life of normalcy, the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews has continued to support those in the Holy Land facing the lingering horrors of war and those who are in desperate need. Your ongoing monthly gift of $45 will provide critically needed aid to communities in the north and south parts of Israel devastated by the ongoing war. Your generous donation each month will help deliver to those in need. You can provide hope during a time of great uncertainty with your gift. Bless Israel and her people by visiting supportifcj.org. That's one word, supportifcj.org, or call 888-488-IFCJ. That's 888-488-IFCJ. I've seen some reporting about senior level military brass getting shown the door by Secretary of Defense Hegseth because of
Yeah.
their DEI obsession or some of the ideological stuff that they were pushing. Has that happened? Is that still underway? What's the status of that?
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely still underway. I mean, a lot of people have been blowing smoke saying that this is very atraditional from how an administration works, but not so much. There are these top officials within the DoD that are being evaluated, and rightfully so. I mean, even not to jump too far ahead, but you talk about the Afghan withdrawal. There's a lot of whispers in the hallways on what's going on with the Afghan withdrawal, whether this is going to be a full-on investigation or is this a review. You can see in public source, open source, that there was a review in which intelligence information was given and gathered appropriately, but the Biden administration, and say Milley to be specific, looked at that and made the calls that they still did, which resulted in that terrible withdrawal in Kabul. But at the end of the day, people still need to answer to that. This administration's not taking that lightly. And I know that I think they're going towards a direction of a pure investigation, because people do need to be physically removed after that terrible withdrawal. But outside of that, too, when you talk about the DEI programs, I mean, these top officials were implementing and rolling out and saying it's okay. Even though the Biden administration said these things are acceptable, it trickles down, it's top down, right? So even if the Biden administration, like what they did, they rolled out a memo in which they allowed the military to grow out their hair, have their beards, do hair dye or highlights or even nail polish, which sounds incredibly silly, but they said that those things are allowed, but on an operational level, it's absolutely not allowed in particular places where it's more of covert operations, where you don't want to just signal out yourself to an adversary. So those questions need to be answered. And at this point, it's really interesting because a lot of the times with a chain of command in the military, it could be an easy answer of, well, it was directed by the president that this was allowed. But then you have to go under all of that and look at, well, operationally, was this cohesive with the mission? And it's not. And a lot of times people are forgetting in this culture war that we're in, that individuality is not celebrated in the military. Individuality and ability is and recognized, and those people are placed in positions pertinent to what they can and can't do. But as far as the aesthetics, I mean, in what world does that ever actually work in the military? Who's stopping for a quick second on the battlefront and going, I like those uniforms, I want to check those out, I'm not going to shoot you? It just doesn't happen. So there's a lot more turnover that's going to be placed at the Pentagon. I mean, the first week or two of Hegseth being on in there, the top commanders were removed. So there's also another element, though, too, for some commanders. There was one specific in the Navy where there was a ship crash. And for things like that, a chain of command, they're going to be removed. A lot of mainstream media was sounding the alarm again, saying that this was part of the DOJ effort. But that's just traditional DOD operations if something goes awry, such as that.
Are there already signs that there'll be specific DOD and DOJ collaboration on things like the Pentagon audit that apparently can never be passed? I mean, what can you tell us about cutting or trimming the fat within the military-industrial complex as part of all this?
Yeah, fair question. Well, the DOJ team came into the Pentagon and they conducted an initial audit, and they're still conducting more. Now, in that initial audit, they focused on mostly, like, as you know, typical, those DEI initiatives, and then, you know, kind of on that same level, the climate change initiatives, in which there was a lot of pushback too, where it was, well, the DoD needs to know about the climate to be able to react going back into their logistics of planning and posturing themselves all across the country. Now, I mean, considering the southern border, but certainly globally. But this is more of a point of, you cut out the fat, which is what DOJ has done with the DEI initiatives at the Pentagon specifically. Now you're parsing out these other elements of which we still have other government agencies and entities that do cross-sharing with DoD liaisons that can give them that said, you know, precious climate information to relay back when it's mission pertinent. So I expect after the DEI, after the climate change axing, it's going to be more on the sense of what else is already actually being conducted, especially because, you know, Buck, the DoD and the IC integrate tremendously. So that's not necessarily going to change, but it's reallocating those efforts that are already established, looking at something like Department of Energy, Department of Agriculture. There's plenty of organizations and government agencies that already fulfill these asks or the need for intel that are already being provided. You don't need to just completely bloat the system and have, I guess, your desk officers sitting there and doing the same reinventing of the wheel that's already been created. So I think those are the things that they're still going to be focusing on. There's a lot more clean house to do on that front. But again, it's kind of been a little bit more less emphasized considering, Ukraine, Gaza, southern border, all the like.
Earlier this week on Wednesday morning, a conversation came out on video between my father and me. He shared his most recent prediction on what's next in the stock markets. This is in my dad's wheelhouse. He made his life's work predicting the markets with a lot of success. My dad made his living researching and predicting the stock markets, and now you can see his latest prediction and the thinking behind it online. It's at a website set up for you to watch on demand, disruption2025.com. It's video, and it's super easy for you to register free of charge to check this out. My dad created a name for himself on Wall Street with his big prediction back in 1987 that the stock market was going to crash, and it did. His predictions since then are too numerous to mention, but needless to say, you'll want to check out his next one. Sign up for this free event. Go watch it yourself. Disruption2025.com. That's disruption2025.com. Paid for by Paradigm Press. How's morale, would you say, from inside the Pentagon, given all these changes? And I'm sure the gray hairs who got the boot by Secretary Hegseth are not happy. But I just mean from as much as you can pick it up from the rank and file, do a lot of them feel like, hey, a focus on war fighting and cleaning up some of the bureaucratic mess here is a good thing? Or because in other places it's not, right? Like USAID does not want the mess cleaned up. But is the Pentagon pretty, is the rank and file pretty positive about this stuff?
Yeah, it absolutely is. No question about it. That's like the one, that's there's so many reasons why I love focusing on DOD and IC operations, and then being there in person just takes it to a whole other level. But it's because these are people that genuinely do, not to sound so cliche, but they genuinely do love their country. They're still holding on to. I was in the hallway last week and I was talking to some senior military officials on the Army side, and they were all just recounting the very first, propaganda-esque, join the Army, first commercial they ever saw as kids. And then being there for so long, some of these 10, 20, 30 years, some of them, and seeing the complete culture shift change, being bloated with people that are just, again, we talk about even military standards. That's going to be a huge thing that's changing, and the physical fitness side. And these standards were being lowered and the floodgates had opened, that it wasn't this war fighting complex that these guys signed up for. I'll tell you, they're incredibly eager and want to be a part of the efforts at the southern border. I know Northcom and Southcom announced that they're bolstering more joint efforts, especially on the drone side. And I only think that's going to continue. It is a direct conduit into the results that we've seen at the southern border being far less aggressive by the cartels, because they just don't have the defense spending. They're super lucrative, right? But the DoD has a $900 billion defense budget, and that just doesn't compare. You look at China; they're sitting at $300 billion. So we're far surpassing them at this moment, and we're far more capable and have the right resources. Again, it's just cutting the fat and redirecting where the mission set is. So the sentiments and the morale within the building is an absolute yes. I think the only heartburn that people would see when it comes to these Doge audits, or say the Afghan withdrawal, from what I've heard, was again, DoD follows a chain of command. So when there is intel being presented and it's not being acknowledged or chosen to be factored or digested in a different way to make poor operational decisions, it's really tough for those people that are kind of, a level or two below that higher call to defend themselves, other than saying, I listened to my most senior officer and that's what I decided to do. So I think that's the bigger picture. All this cultural shift, all the mandates that are being dropped, all good. Everyone's happy with it. But now it's people having to answer to direct orders that they, by the signature on the contract that they put down to join the military, how to follow through with. So it would be really interesting to see how Hegseth and his team kind of course correct and make right from things like the Afghan withdrawal, considering that they also understand the chain of command is what made everyone's, hands tied to a degree.
OAN Pentagon correspondent Gabrielle Cuccia, great to see you. We'll talk to you again soon about all things DoD.
Sounds great. Thanks, Buck, for having me.